All right, here we are. I'm just pulling up the syllabus to see what we are up to this week. Oh, okay, good. So, all right. So, hey, everybody. Let's recap where we are. It's 10 o'clock on Monday, July 13th, and 2020. And this is History 181. And we're going to be talking about, announcements and schedule things and test things. And then we will be going over the material heading toward exam 3, I believe. Yeah. So last week, we went ahead and finished up what'll be on exam 2. And exam 2, I believe, should pop up for you to be able to start taking it as soon as this class is over. So I believe at 11 o'clock today, as soon as our little video session is over live, I think most of you watch it on tape, and that's fine, or later, delayed, but that's fine. But as soon as it finishes live at 11 o'clock, your exam should pop up available, and I believe it will be there for a week through midnight or almost midnight a week from today, July 20th. It's the second test. It's your midterm. So it covers what we've done so far after the growth and transformation, right? Okay, so it covers the test that goes up today, covers Part 4, Discontent and Reform, Part 5, Progressives, Part 6, World War I, Part 7, the Roaring Twenties, and Part 8, the 30s. Those are mostly short sections, though, so it sounds like more than it really is, but it is still a good bit. So we got to cram it all in here. So that test will go up. It has an essay component to it. Make sure you read the instructions. You're only going to do one essay and quite a few multiple choice. So make sure you have enough time to get it in. And let's see. Meanwhile, we're going to start now with the material for test 3. Test 3 will go up on let's see. I have it down under week of July 20th, which is next Monday. But I think that really that means we'll put it up on July 27th. Well, I guess that just doesn't leave enough time. So I'll go ahead and put it up. I'll make it available after class next. I'll make exam 3 available after class next Monday. But there'll be a little bit of it we still have to cover that day. But we'll have covered it by the time. You finish that class, which is the Korean War. All right. So again, let's lay it out. Test number 2 will go up at 11 o'clock today. It'll be available for a week. It covers the last 4 or 5 sections we've done through the end of last time. My daughter's making all kinds of noises like a rabid squirrel. I don't know what she's doing. Next week, test number 3 will go up and we'll cover World War II, the origins of the Cold War, and Korea. So today we're scheduled to do the first 2 of those, World War II and the origins of the Cold War. So let's get on into it. As always, if you're watching live, you can drop me questions and comments on the side. If you're watching this recorded later, that's fine. You can email me or we can set up a meeting to discuss anything you want to discuss. By the way, don't forget your papers are coming up. They're due by midnight Monday, July 27th. So you got basically 2 more weeks to get them done, but you don't want to cram everything to the end. I will be grading your essay exams that go up today as they come in over the course of the week. That's what I've been doing for 101. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get on into World War II and the origins of the Cold War. Okay, that's cool. We can do that. All right, so we're going to zip through World War II here. We could spend a whole lot of time on it. In World Civ 2, I spent like a week or 2 on World War II, but we're going to zip right through it here because we just don't have the time in the summer. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about who's on each side first, and then we're going to kind of zip along through the battles and the key important moments. And we're going to go at ludicrous speed, as they say in Spaceballs. Remember, you can always rewind this, watch it again. You got your PowerPoint, you got your textbook. You should be okay. I'm just going to zip right along. All right, so in World War II, the two sides, once again, you had the Allies. The U.S., Britain, France, Russia always seem to be on the Allied side in these things. But the thing to understand about World War II compared to World War I, World War I was a war between family dynasties, right? You had the Romanov dynasty in Russia, the Hohenzollern dynasty in Germany, the Habsburg dynasty in Austria, the Windsor, the Saxe-Coburg dynasty in Britain, on and on and on. It destroyed those royal families, most of them, not all. They were replaced largely by political parties. So World War II is really, in some ways, the world's first big political party conflict. And we know all about those, right, internally, right? But it's the world's first really big political party conflict because what had replaced those royal families was political parties. In some cases, very extreme political parties. Okay, so the Allies in World War II were the politically left-leaning socialist, communist, and centrist countries. So you had the Soviet Union way out on the far left, communist. You had France, kind of socialist, middle. Britain, a little more toward the center. The United States, kind of dead center. And then this was the Republic of China, pre-communism, who was a little bit right of center, but that's about as far right as you go. So you had the far left and the middle against the far right. Germany, Japan, Italy were all fascist far right. So the left countries were Britain and France and the Soviet Union, who didn't really like each other very much, but the one thing they could agree on was they liked the Germans less. So they teamed up out of necessity, more or less. And then the Republic of China, which today is isolated on Taiwan and is called Taiwan. But back then, that was the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. And then after, of course, Pearl Harbor, which we saw last time, you would get late to the party, as always, the United States after December 7th, 1941. Those were the major allies. There were dozens of others. Eventually, Panama, Costa Rica, Brazil, Greece. Everybody's on the Allied side eventually because they're winning, probably. But at the time, these are the five main Allied powers. The other side was called the Axis. I kid you not, it's because they thought the world revolved around them. So they are the Axis. That's literally what it means. The world revolves around us. We are the Axis. They were the far right fascist country. So you've got, if you had I used to have it, but I've redecorated down here and I don't have it anymore. But if you had the political spectrum laid out, you got the left, the right, and the center. Okay. High tech. So you have the Soviet Union and communism over here. You have the Nazis, the Japanese, and the Italian fascists over here. And so the United States is kind of right here. So you have us, Britain, the Republic of China, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union all teamed up together. The reason this is so weird is because it's opposite on the screen from me. You have all these, there we go, I'm looking at the card back, not at the video. You have all these teamed up together as the Allies against them. Okay, so, looking for another pen. So, World War II, is high tech. It works. It's what I would be doing on the dry erase board, so it's about the same thing, right? So you have the Allies on the left teamed up against the Axis on the right. Now, let me go ahead and give you a quick fast forward. The Axis will lose, thank goodness, right? And so we kind of go zzz, 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 and we saw off See, we sawed off the far right. So after World War II, you don't really have the far right in the world anymore. Not much. Not much. A little bit. So after World War II, it becomes the centrist countries. It becomes the centrist countries versus the far left. So the Cold War emerges when the two sets of allies turn against each other after defeating Germany and Japan. So you got the Soviets out here on the far left and the communist Chinese later against the United States, Britain, France, and then Germany becomes a democracy. You know, Japan becomes a democracy. So you have the Western and Asian democracies against the communists. And so, of course, in the Cold War, spoiler, in the Cold War, the communists lose, and all that's really left today, more or less, is the center. That's all that's really left today. All right. Again, I would be doing that the same thing on the dry erase board, so it wasn't as crude as it probably came across. All right. Let me get back to it. So, of course, you know the axis was Germany, Japan, and Italy, Nazis, whatever the Japanese called themselves, and the fascists. And just some propaganda. Again, I'm going to zip right along here. Again, that shows you how many countries end up joining the Allies. They later changed their name to the United Nations. And that's what the UN is named after, was the Allies of World War II. And it's just to remind us that they had to conserve food and stuff back then, that we're spoiled today that we don't suffer during war. And that's great, but it makes it easier to go to war when the people don't really have to pay any price for it. All right, so I'm going to look at Europe first and then the Pacific. And we got to zip right along here. I'm being too slow. Got a lot to cover. So so after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. joins up with the British. And 42-43, we take the Nazis out of North Africa. We invade the little island of Sicily off the boot of Italy. And then work our way up the boot of Italy. And Italy surrenders very quickly. That was easy. Wasn't easy, but it seems easy. But the Germans stayed in Italy, and we had to fight them. So Italy was not going to be an easy way into Europe, because not only the Alps, right, that Hannibal had to use elephants to get over, they're so high, kind of walling Italy off from the rest of Europe, but also the Germans were there fighting. You can see, right? So we'd gone across North Africa down here. You can't really see that part. Gone into Sicily, and then fought our way all the way up to here, but the Alps kind of block off the rest of Europe from Italy. So Italy was out of the fight, but the Germans were still there fighting us. So we're going to need another place to attack, and of course that's going to be Normandy here. All right, Hitler orders the invasion of the Soviet Union. So the Germans attack Russia basically in 1941. This is called the Eastern Front. The United States puts General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the future president, in charge of the Allied forces in Europe. So Ike would be the supreme commander in Europe. And finally, after all of 42, all of 43, and half of 44, the United States joins with Britain and the Free French to cross the English, and the Canadians and the Australians and New Zealand, all that, to cross the English Channel and invade France to attack the Nazis who had overrun France. So the battle starting on June 6th, D-Day in Europe, was America, Britain, and our other allies attacking the Nazis who had taken over France several years earlier. So this is a massive Allied invasion of Europe, the largest amphibious, meaning over water, invasion in history. And the Allies crossed the English Channel from Britain into Normandy, France. This is the second front, right? The first front was the Eastern Front with the Russians. So now we've opened up a second front to take pressure off of the Soviet Union and to fight on our side. So there's all the ships landing on the coast. France. And the New York Times reported this massive invasion is underway. Okay, I mentioned this briefly. We talk about it in U.S. at War class, whenever that class makes. Operation Market Garden was the British plan, General Montgomery's plan, to try to parachute troops behind the German lines and seize the bridges in the Netherlands. And it did not work. It was a disaster. We lost more men with Market Garden than we lost with D-Day. So if you want to, you can look it up, read about it if you want to. There's a movie called A Bridge Too Far with Sean Connery and some other actors. It's really good about this. And Anthony Hopkins. It's really good, called A Bridge Too Far. There's a couple of books about it, but this is an operation the Allies attempted after D-Day that failed. So we're going to have to just fight our way. We couldn't parachute over them. We're going to have to fight our way through the Nazis all the way to Berlin. The Nazis did a counterattack against the Allies to try to push us all the way back into the ocean. This was called the Battle of the Bulge. For a couple of months, it was very successful. The place you can see this really, there's a movie called this. The movie's not that good. The place you can really see a good representation of Battle of the Bulge is in Band of Brothers on HBO. It's a miniseries, and it shows the Battle of the Bulge. Very good. So for a while, the Nazis actually counterattacked and tried to push us back into the ocean, but eventually they literally ran out of gasoline. The big problem the Nazis were having in the European war was that we gained air superiority early on, and we started bombing their oil refineries. So we blew up all the places that the Nazis could get gasoline. And so they started running out of gas for their tanks, their airplanes, and that really hurt them. From 44 through 45, after D-Day, after Market Garden, the British, the French, now the French have been liberated. They're on our side too. The three of us pushed toward Berlin from the west. Meanwhile, the Soviet Red Army has defeated the Nazis in Russia, and now they are pushing toward Berlin from the east. So this pincer movement is closing in on Berlin. Imagine my nose is Berlin, and they're closing in from both sides. And the Nazis are in deep trouble now. This is why they start trying to get rid of all the evidence of the Holocaust with the ovens and everything. These are cool Russian propaganda posters like "On to Berlin," right? Let's go get revenge on the Nazis. They do not look happy, the Russians, after what the Nazis had done to them. It was pretty horrible. May of 45, the Allied forces overrun Berlin. Hitler commits suicide in his bunker. The Russian forces, the Soviet Red Army, actually gets to Berlin. Look at the condition Berlin was in by this point, just trashed. And so Soviet Red Army soldiers climbed up on top of Hitler's Capitol building, the Reichstag, and raised that Soviet communist flag up over Berlin. There would be a communist flag flying over East Berlin for the next 45 years of the Cold War. So Germany surrenders unconditionally. We had learned, right, after World War I, you need the enemy to surrender unconditionally. We negotiated World War I's ending, and it was a disaster. So we said, this is just, you're just going to have to surrender. Your country goes away, right? There will be no Germany for a couple of years while we reorganize this area and these people. Give you democracy. Hitler commits suicide in his bunker. The war in Europe ends, and Soviet troops raise their flag. Now, Germany at the end of this war would be divided. The communists, the Soviets, were governing this part, the yellow part. Okay. The Americans were governing the purple part down here around Frankfurt, plus Bremen to have an outlet to the water. The British were in the green part, and the French just crossed right over their own border into the orange part. So Germany was divided into four pieces, controlled by the four main allies when we were still getting along. And Berlin itself was divided into four occupation zones by the four countries. But here's the key. This is super, super important for our next section. We're going to talk about the Pacific War. I'm going to talk about the Japanese. But I've got to tell you first, this is super important. Berlin itself was divided into four zones of occupation, but Berlin was inside the Russian zone of the country. That meant that the British, French, and American parts of Berlin were inside the Russian part of the whole country, you see. So that made the parts that were not Russian a little island of democracy in a sea of Soviet and East German communism. They're going to later be called West Germany and East Germany, but not immediately. But eventually, all three of these are united as West Germany democracies, as a democracy. And East Germany, the Soviets keep their part out and call it East Germany or the German Democratic Republic. Remember, during the Cold War era, any country that called itself a democratic republic was usually neither. North Korea is like the Democratic People's Republic, and it's like, no, you're not. You're not at all. Okay, so the U.S., the Soviet Union, France, and Britain each get a piece of Germany and a piece of Berlin itself inside East Germany. The fact that it's inside East Germany is super important for what we're going to see later. Okay, so that's the war in Europe very, very quickly. Now let's look at the Pacific. There's General MacArthur, the Army general who would be put in charge of much of the U.S. force, the Allied forces, and really in the Pacific, it was mostly the U.S. We had a lot more help in Europe. In the Pacific, it's pretty much us straight up against Japan. So he was Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Pacific. There were also Admiral Nimitz and Admiral King back in Hawaii, but MacArthur was in charge of the actual ground forces on these islands. So the Japanese had carved out quite a huge empire by 1942. They had big chunks of China and Korea, as well as Indochina and what they call the Netherlands East Indies back then, all the way out almost. And there's where they attacked Midway, we'll get to in a second, and there's when they attacked Pearl Harbor and Alaska. This is a huge empire. Just a lot of it was water. Now, this map is very useful, but let me blow it up for you. It shows just how much the Japanese actually conquered. Right there, you can see they had Manchuria, parts of China, part of Korea, all of Korea, actually. They had Southeast Asia, all of that. Now, what the blue lines show you is the American counterattack the other way. So we come with a two-pronged attack heading toward the home islands of Japan. And I may refer back to these maps as we go. All right, so the first big battle is down here in the Coral Sea north of Australia. What happened was the Japanese needed natural resources, and so they attacked Australia. But on their way to attack Australia, the U.S. Navy knew they were coming. Oh, how do we know that? I'll tell you in just a minute. And so we put our 3 aircraft. We had 3 aircraft carriers. This is how bad off the United States was at the beginning of this war, is that Japan had like 7 aircraft carriers. We had 3. So we put our 3 aircraft carriers in their path in the Coral Sea north of Australia and fought a big air battle in early 1942, and we stopped their advance. Now, we suffered tremendous losses. One of our carriers was nearly destroyed and had to limp all the way back to either Hawaii or Los Angeles for major repairs. But we also shot down a lot of their airplanes, bearing in mind their pilots had been fighting for years and were super seasoned. Our pilots were green. They'd never fought anybody before. And so the fact that we fought Japan to a draw, to a standstill in the first battle, upset. It was quite a surprise, quite a shock and an upset. And that was good. Now, how did we know they were coming? We had what was called the ultra secret. The United States, you may have seen that movie that showed how the British cracked the German military codes with Benedict Cumberbatch in it. Well, the United States had cracked the Japanese military codes. Not all of it, but we could get a general sense of what they were saying in their codes. So we knew they were heading toward Australia, and we put our carriers in their way, and that was a big, it was a draw, but it was a draw that was a win, you know. And then this was the first setback for the Japanese. It was a carrier battle. Really the first big carrier battle in history, meaning airplanes fought it, not ships. It was fought with airplanes. The ships never even saw each other. We had entered into a new phase of warfare in the world where ocean battles, sea battles, are now air battles. Meaning that, you know, for all of history, whoever could make the biggest ships with the biggest weapons, catapults, flamethrowers, guns, right, like battleships, whoever could make the biggest, most powerful of those would control the seas. Well, not anymore. Because by World War II, there were some awfully big battleships out there. And all it took was one little airplane with a torpedo, dropping that torpedo and hitting them, or dropping a bomb on their deck to put a hole in them, and they're the Titanic. Or a submarine torpedoing them. So big, giant, ocean-going battleships, it's like the moment that they became super high-tech, they became obsolete. You were much better off building a couple of aircraft carriers and putting airplanes on them, or building some submarines, than you were putting all this money and all these sailors and all these weapons on a battleship that can't really do anything and is going to get sunk by one little tiny airplane or submarine. So the day of the battleship came and went at about the same time. It's amazing. There's never really been in the history of the world a modern battleship battle. Never has. Because by the time they had battleships that sophisticated, they had airplanes, and airplanes can sink them. Submarines can sink them. So there's what the aircraft carriers looked like. They were very small compared to today, but they still carried a lot of airplanes. There's the Battle of the Coral Sea, aircraft carriers blazing. So the Japanese regrouped after the Coral Sea and said, we need to do something bigger and more audacious like the Pearl Harbor attack to teach these Americans a lesson. If we could take out Midway Island. Let me go back again, show you the map. So Midway Island is here. Very close. It's at the tail end of the Hawaiian island chain, really. Right? This is all a chain of islands that starts with the big island of Hawaii and goes all the way to Midway. Midway across the Pacific Ocean. California's over here somewhere. Okay. So the Japanese said, if we could attack the American forces on Midway, we could seize Midway. It's a little island, but it has a runway. And we could fly planes off of Midway and attack Hawaii day and night as much as we wanted. Midway would be an awesome jumping off point to attack Hawaii, and then we could even attack California, right? So this is the target. And the United States was pretty sure that Midway was the target. But here's what happened. We couldn't be positive. We understood their code, but it's like when you crack the Japanese code, the code said, we are preparing to attack target X. Well, what's target X? I don't know. So the admirals in Hawaii sent a top secret coded message to Midway. And they said, Midway, radio us back in the open where anybody can hear it and say your water recycling systems are broken and you need repairs. Midway gets this secret message and they're like, what? Our recycling systems aren't broken. Well, we're given orders to do this, so let's just do it. So the Midway guys get on the radio, go, attention Hawaii, this is Midway. Our water reclamation recycling systems are broken. We need replacement. Over. Immediately, the Japanese secret code flashes out. Target X water recycling systems are broken. Boom, we got them. We got them to tip their hand. And so Admiral Nimitz and Admiral King send everything we've got, which by this point is 2 carriers, and then they get the other one kind of halfway fixed and send it back out. And so we send everything we have to Midway, and we wait. And remember, the Japanese think that we have no clue they're coming. The Japanese think that our ships are 1,000 miles away in Hawaii or California. So our carriers are waiting. And in June of 42, this is the turning point of the war in the Pacific. We intercept those coded signals, and we surprise this much larger. It's pretty much the same carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, so there's a nice revenge element there. But our carrier fleet surprises this larger, more powerful Japanese fleet. I also got to mention the airplanes. The Japanese used the Zero, the Mitsubishi Zero, made by the same Mitsubishi company that makes cars today. I had an Eclipse I bought a brand new Mitsubishi Eclipse in 2003, and I asked the dealer in Georgia, just good old American boy from Georgia, right? I said, did anybody ever mention to you that your company made the airplanes that bombed Pearl Harbor? And he looks up and goes, every damn day. I'm like, oh, sorry. So the Mitsubishi Zero in the late 30s and around the time of Pearl Harbor was a very good plane. But what do we know about American military might is one thing is we innovate and we make new and better stuff very quickly, right? We're always making new high-tech stuff. So by the time the war really gets going, we're no longer flying the same planes we were flying in the 30s. By this point, we're flying Corsairs and Mustangs, which were awesome airplanes. The Japanese, though, because they were limited in their resources and everything, were still flying Zeros. The Zero, it had been the Japanese Zero, American planes and pilots, and very quickly the Zero stayed the same and our planes went up to here. And so we do tremendous damage, take out the Japanese carriers, the Hiryu, Soryu, Kaga, and the Akagi. And the U.S. would now be on the offensive. The Japanese would now be retreating, just like the Germans, back toward the home base. And there's a American, like a Corsair, attacking a Japanese carrier. Yeah, I didn't even mention the fact that the Japanese carriers, they had taken old battleships and just taken the top off and laid down wooden decks for the planes to land on. So you had aviation fuel sitting on wooden decks when these American planes came along. That's a bad combination for the Japanese carriers. And there's the U.S. planes, the dive bombers attacking. Okay. So MacArthur had been headquartered at the Philippines, and at the same time, we all talk about Pearl Harbor, but we forget the same time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, didn't take it, they also captured the Philippine Islands, and MacArthur had to retreat and flee. And when he left, he said, "I shall return." Well, he does. As we start island hopping toward Japan, the U.S. lands on the Philippines and defeat the Japanese there. And this is a famous photo that MacArthur had taken of himself and his top leaders wading ashore on the Philippines, and he said, "I have returned." I always thought it was funny that he let the cameraman get off the ship first to take a picture. Nobody look at the camera. This one guy is kind of looking at the camera. No, don't look at the camera. It's like we're the first people to set foot. See? I love it. It's propaganda, but it's important. It was for morale, So we go on to fight two more really big battles. I'm skipping through like Guadalcanal and stuff. We don't really have time to go into that. But the last two big battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the thing that was important about those islands, Iwo Jima's here. Okinawa is actually right here. I mean, we're getting really close to Japan at this point. Iwo Jima had a runway on it. So now instead of the Japanese flying bombers off of Midway to attack Hawaii, the tables are turned, and we are flying bombers off of Iwo Jima and Okinawa to attack Tokyo and Yokohama. And we begin what was called the firebombing of Japan, which is just brutal. We killed the American it was the Army Air Corps. It wasn't Air Force yet. The Army Air Corps, they killed more Japanese and did more damage to Japan with the firebombing than they did with the two atomic bombs that we're about to get to. Because these incendiary bombs just lit, the Japanese cities were made out of bamboo and paper. And they just absolutely lit them up. In fact, the Japanese out on the streets would die of suffocation. They'd be lying on the ground like fish that were pulled out of the water and thrown on the land. They'd be lying there on the ground going, because the fires burned so hot as their cities burned around them that it sucked all the oxygen up. And people were collapsing dead of suffocation from the fires. It was absolutely horrific. In fact, Robert McNamara, who went on to be the Secretary of State for John F. Kennedy in the 60s, McNamara was part of the planning of this, and he later said, if we had lost the war, we would have deserved to be taken up on war crimes charges for what we did to the civilian population of Japan. But again, they could have surrendered, and they just wouldn't surrender. It was against the Japanese code to surrender, and they wouldn't surrender. And so finally, while that's happening, in November of 1944, Franklin Roosevelt wins his unprecedented fourth term. So he picks his new vice president, Harry Truman. So Franklin Roosevelt is elected for a fourth term as president in November of 1944 with Harry Truman as his president. And then a few months later, in April of 1945, Roosevelt dies. And this guy that nobody knew anything about, Harry Truman, is suddenly the president. And the American people were freaking out because nobody knew anything about Truman. How good of a president will he be? We don't know. So we were preparing to actually land the Marines on the coast of Japan, land the Army on the coast of Japan, and fight house to house, man to man. Estimates said 500,000 American soldiers would die and probably millions of Japanese because they wouldn't surrender, and they would fight us to the last man, woman, and child. We'd basically have to erase Japan to win the war. Well, Truman finds out that we've been working on the Manhattan Project. Has nothing to do with Manhattan. That's one of the few places it wasn't really at. They just picked that code name. Albert Einstein had come up with the idea of splitting the atom and releasing all this energy, and his protege Oppenheimer, J. Robert Oppenheimer, was put in charge of making it happen. And so this is the name of the U.S. effort to develop atomic and then later nuclear weapons. There's Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist in charge. Truman said, go ahead, how many we got? Well, we had 3. We built 3 originally. They tested one in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and it quite worked. It probably gave everybody there cancer, honestly. They didn't really know what they were doing. But it works. They had 2 left in the first batch. And so Truman says, I want to save the lives of American soldiers, and I want to save the lives of the Japanese, right? Because a lot more Japanese would be killed from an invasion than would die from 2 big bombs, even though they're big. So to end the war sooner, and look, I would put it this way. I have a hard time, getting the feedback from you guys over video, but this is what usually happens in class. I explain this and I say this. I say, look, dropping atomic bombs on Japan was terrible. There's no doubt. It's like the last resort. And it's horrible, absolutely. But the alternative would have probably been much worse. And not only would millions of Japanese died, but many, many Americans would have died as well. This way, no Americans died, and a relatively small number of Japanese died to end the war. Okay, so I'm never going to defend dropping the atomic bombs. I'm never going to say it was a good thing. I'm just saying it's a lesser evil compared to what it could have been. Okay. So we dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. If I had any time in class, I'd describe how it works. But Japan doesn't respond. They don't really know what's going on. A couple of days later, we dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. And this time, Japan surrenders unconditionally. And there's the Japanese government and military figures coming out to the Missouri to surrender in Tokyo Bay. And the famous picture of the celebration in Times Square in New York, where a sailor grabbed the nearest nurse and kissed her, and she's like, wait, what? So the war is completely over now, and the United Nations is set up by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union in New York City. The Security Council of the UN, we talked about that a little bit in the Cold War coming up, with the winners of the war. The Nuremberg trials were held in Germany after the war to convict the Nazis of crime, the surviving Nazis of crimes against humanity for the Holocaust, killing all the Jews, so many Jews. This was the end of U.S. isolationism. We would now be a major player. The U.S. Senate went along with the UN, unlike the League of Nations. And you now have a bipolar world where Western Europe is kind of caught in the middle, reduced in stature it had since Columbus, where you have America on one side and the Soviet Union on the other, and Europe had to pick a side. The end of colonialism in places like Africa and Asia, and the U.S. and the Soviet Union would each dominate half of the globe in the coming of the Cold War. All right, so let's get on into that real quick. The coming of the Cold War. Got about 20 minutes. If whatever we don't finish today, we can finish next time and finish up in time for the test. All right, so the origins of the Cold War. The 20th century was called by this point the American century because we were so involved in everything. We had won the war. In 1946, we set up the World Bank and the IMF to help poor countries to develop, to build industry and stuff. So the U.S. was basically shaping the modern world economy as soon as World War II was over. We went from hiding under the bed, isolationism, to basically running the world, becoming the new Roman Empire. So we led the free world in the fight against Soviet Union and communism in the Cold War. The U.S. and Western Europe developed the welfare state, which meant that we were afraid that too many poor people would lead to more communist revolutions. So instead of having a communist revolution, the government would try to take care of people. Now, today, many of us look at the welfare state idea and say, this is the government giving free money, taxpayer money to poor people that are lazy. I understand that side of it, but others say this is the government trying to avoid communist revolution by making sure that you don't have too many poor people running around wanting to start a revolution. There's two sides to everything, right? So this was a very prosperous country. The U.S. at the end of World War II, believe it or not, had half the world's gross national product, meaning that of all the money being produced in industry, we produced half, and every other country put together on earth the other half. So today, when we have about a quarter of the world's GNP, we feel like, oh, what's wrong with America? Why are we so lazy and not as productive as we used to be? No, we work harder today than anybody. We work harder than we used to. But you can't expect that the same circumstances that made us have half the world's GNP back then would be around today. Because back then, all of our competitors, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, were blown up. They're in pieces. Today, they're all cranking out Toyotas and Hondas and Mercedes and BMWs. It's not the same world as it was back then, okay? Americans get so wrought up about how we've declined. We haven't declined. We're better than ever. It's just that our competition is 1,000 times better than it was back then. You can't expect to keep. It's kind of like, if the Cardinals won the World Series because every other baseball team didn't show up for play baseball. Well, you can't expect that every year. Eventually, they're going to show up, The baby boom came along during these years. All those soldiers came back from World War II, got married, and had like 3 or 4 kids immediately. And so you get where the demographic line for the United States was this, and then the baby boom is born and then back down to normal again by about the 60s. So the biggest demographic bulge in American history was born between 1945 and about 60. I am not a boomer. I'm a proud Generation X member. So you millennials and you baby boomers, fight to your heart's content. We Generation X are standing here on the sideline going, man, they're crazy. Although we do have what they call the Karens, right? Sorry, I apologize for the Karens. My daughter always tells me that we have the Karens, and I'm like, okay, whatever that is, fine. Anyway. Discontent among minorities. Okay, what happened was women got to go work in the factories. They liked having money. They didn't want to go back to being housewives, many of them, not all. Minorities, black soldiers particularly, got to go serve in Europe, serve in Asia, were treated good, didn't understand why they were treated bad once they came back to their own country. So growing discontent going to lead to the civil rights. It's not a coincidence that the civil rights movement begins as soon as World War II ends. Makes perfect sense. So the Cold War gets going. Stalin in the Soviet Union says, I'm not leaving Eastern Europe. He was supposed to, but he's like, no, I'm staying here. I'm not going to hold free elections. You're going to have communist dictators in all those Eastern European countries. So we're going to have a confrontation with the U.S. allies instead of remaining as allies. So Prime Minister Churchill goes and gives a speech in the Vol places considered the beginning of the Cold War. So Europe is divided with the green. Is audio messing up? Hold on. So Europe is divided with the green countries being democracies pro-America and the red countries being communist and under the control of the Soviet Union, including the eastern part of Germany we were talking about before. See there? But see, Berlin is right in there. So you should have a green dot right there. They don't show up. There's a green dot right in the middle of East Germany, a little island of freedom in the middle of communism. That's going to be really important. So the U.S. is like, how do we deal with the Soviet Union going against everything they promised and being our enemies now? Well, we don't want to start World War III. So instead of World War III, we'll do this containment. We'll just surround the Soviet Union with our allies and just try to hold them in like a quarantine until this communism thing runs its course. We treat it kind of like the virus, right? We're just going to lock them down and hold them still until it runs its course. It was suggested in 1946 to prevent the further spread. Now, here's the thing. Containment means that we're committed to going to war if communism tries to spread. So you might well ask, why did the United States get into a war in Korea? Why did we get into a war in Vietnam? Well, because communism was spreading to those places, and we had promised with our containment policy we would prevent the further spread. Did we care about a war in Korea? No. Did we care about a war in Vietnam? No. Did we care about communism spreading into those places? Oh, absolutely we did. Yes. See, so we get involved in wars in places we don't care about, really, because communism, Cold War, that trumped everything. So this meant a Cold War. If we were not going to start World War III, instead, we're going to have a Cold War where we're just confronting, no direct military clash, we're just confronting. And of course, ultimately, after 45 long years, this would be successful. We just wore them down, really. Okay. The Truman Doctrine was just President Truman's actual policies for enforcing containment to prevent the spread of communism. Oops, sorry, just one. So he was just saying that we will go anywhere, help any friend, fight any foe to prevent the spread of communism. So in other words, the Truman Doctrine is just basically like the policy edition of the idea of containment. Okay. The Marshall Plan was the economic component. We will give money to our friends to help them build up quickly against the communist enemy to the east. So those countries were so devastated by the war, we had to help them, build back up to defend themselves against communism. And it was enormously successful because what did those countries do with all that American aid money? They bought American cars and American trucks and American food. So we got the money back and made money off of it, made a profit. Now, some people try to take advantage of this rising communist threat to help themselves. The junior senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, thought, I can really make myself a big shot by being the most anti-communist in the government. And if I start accusing everybody else of being a communist, then it makes me look better and makes them look worse. And so McCarthy starts going on television in the early days of TV and all this and doing all this stuff. He starts stirring up anti-communist hysteria. Now, it's one thing to be rightly concerned about communism and opposed to it, yes. But you don't go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, like the house is on fire, And that's what he did, and he started accusing everybody he didn't like of being a communist. And I love this cartoon. He's, in the name of putting out this fire, he's throwing a bucket of water on the torch of the Statue of Liberty. In other words, he's destroying freedom and liberty in the name of attacking communism. So the second Red Scare, really, but the big Red Scare was him running around screaming, the house is on fire. Eventually, he is discredited, and today it's really only the fringe far right that really thinks he's a good guy. Most people think he was a really vile opportunist trying to take advantage of the situation. So there's Berlin divided in half, and there's famous Checkpoint Charlie sign. And as we're going to see the Berlin Wall built now, you'll see here that they built the wall around the western part of Berlin, the American, British, French part of Berlin, to keep the people from the Russian sector of Berlin and to keep people from East Germany, all the way around East Germany, to keep them from escaping. Think of West Berlin here as the drain in the bathtub. And the bathtub water is communist East Germany. People were going to West Berlin to get out, right? They were going to West Berlin to get out of communism. And so the Berlin Wall, was the communists taking a glass and putting it upside down over the drain to stop that flow out. So Stalin says, before they build the wall, that map was just to show you where it was. So before they build the wall, they don't build the wall until 61. So before they build the wall, Stalin says, I'm going to take over Berlin, all of it. I want all of it. And so I'm going to surround it and cut it off militarily. So we couldn't get trucks in, couldn't get cars in, couldn't get trains in. So President Truman says, we're going to fly airplanes in. So for weeks, the U.S. flew all the supplies West Berlin needed to stay alive in by airplane. And eventually Stalin's like, fine. Because what do you do? You stop a train, you stop a car or a truck by putting up a barricade. The only way to stop an airplane is to shoot it down, and that would be World War III. You'd be starting the war, and Stalin didn't want to do that. So eventually Stalin gave up, and Berlin was incredibly grateful to the United States for coming to their rescue there. So instead, in 1961, the Soviets, these Germans, build the wall around West Berlin. And there's a cross-section of all the different things you had to get through if you climbed over the wall and tried to get... Actually, the communists were on this side. They had to get through the razor wire, the dogs, the landmines, the towers with machine guns, the ditches, the lights, and then they had to climb over the wall into the west. All right, 1949 is an important year in the coming of the Cold War because the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is put together. This is NATO, which is still the alliance we have today. It was anti-communist, it's against the Soviet Union. And it represented collective security, meaning every member who joined NATO was protected by every other member. So if the communists attacked, let's say that Belgium joined it, and they did. If Belgium is a member of NATO and communists attack Belgium, the United States, Britain, everybody else is required to attack the communists who attack Belgium. That's collective security. It's like you form a club of neighborhood watch, and you look out for each other. So NATO was made up of Western Europe, like France, Britain, West Germany, Italy, plus the US and Canada, and then even Turkey down here. Turkey wasn't really on the North Atlantic, but they were part of that containment surrounding the Soviet Union. So the Soviets were like, well, if you can have one of those, we're going to have one. So they formed the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet version of a military alliance. So in other words, if we had ever had World War III, it would have been NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. There's a book, Tom Clancy, one of his first big giant novels. I've waited for them to make a movie out of this forever. I don't guess they ever are. But one of Tom Clancy's first big novels is called Red Storm Rising. And Red Storm Rising is basically NATO versus the Warsaw Pact in World War III without nuclear weapons. It's a very fun read. So there's NATO, North America, plus Western Europe and Turkey. See, we're trying to contain the Soviet Union. We also had Iran, part of an alliance back then, Pakistan, all the way to Japan. See, so we were containing Soviet communism. And there's the Warsaw Pact forces, those MiGs. Okay, also in 49, the Soviet Union develops their own atomic bombs, and by develop, I mean steals ours design pretty much. So now there's a nuclear arms race. Typified by what we call MAD, the greatest acronym ever, mutually assured. In other words, the Russians have nuclear weapons, we have nuclear weapons. Neither side can attack the other because both will be mutually destroyed. Mutually assured that both will be destroyed. It's crazy, it's mad, but it kept the peace for 45 years. Neither side could attack the other without causing a giant nuclear war, and the winners would be the radioactive glowing cockroaches who survived. Now, because we in the Soviet Union could not face each other directly, this led to war by proxy, meaning we had little buddies in parts of the world, they had little buddies in parts of the world, and they fought each other. North and South Vietnam, North and South Korea, on and on and on. Cuba against everybody in Africa, and on and on. Also, this is a big year. Also in 1949, there's a communist revolution in China. So, in Washington, D.C., people were demanding to know the answer to the question, who lost China? What did that mean? It meant that China had been a pro-U.S. Democracy, kind of, but pro-U.S. military dictatorship, honestly. All of a sudden, they had a communist revolution. The communists won. So here the United States was saying, we have the Truman Doctrine, we have containment, to prevent the spread of communism, not one more person, not one more inch of communism. And all of a sudden, the biggest country in population in the world became communist. And people were pointing fingers going, who lost China? Who caused China to become communist? And President Truman was partially held responsible, which was not fair. And so if anywhere else over there was going to become communist after this, Truman might have been impeached. So when a war breaks out in Korea, you'd say, well, why would the U.S. care? And in normal circumstances, the United States would not care a bit about a war in Korea. But when we had just lost China, you don't dare let one more inch become communist without a fight. So the real reason that we go to war in Korea in 1950 is, well, the reason is because the North Korean communists attacked the South Korean non-communists. But what it really goes back to is that China became communist without the United States lifting a finger or firing a shot, which we really shouldn't have. There wasn't anything we could have done. It was just too big and too far away. But We didn't dare let something like that happen again. And so when Korea begins having the same problem China did, President Truman is like, we have to go in there yesterday. We have to go in there now and do something. And so this really leads directly to the war in Korea, because we feared a worldwide communist takeover. I can't stress enough how much the United States based everything we did during the Cold War on this fear of communism. We just absolutely were obsessed. This domino effect. We're like, oh, if it's North Korea today, if it's South Korea tomorrow, it'll be Mexico on Saturday, and Kansas next week will be communist, which was ridiculous. But that's how we thought. Okay, we get it, did it. All right. So we are caught up. Let me wrap up by saying this. Today, I'm going to put exam 2 up as soon as a little after 12 o'clock. No, it's already up, I think. Yeah, your exam 2 is already up and should pop up at 11 o'clock. I'm thinking about a different class. Yeah, in 5 minutes or thereabouts, this exam will pop up on your Blackboard, and you can take it now if you want to. You have all the way through Monday of next week, whenever you want to do it. If you still have questions for me or anything, you can ask. The first thing we will do next Monday is the Korean War, and that'll bring the third test material to an end. Okay, and then after that, we'll continue on into sort of modern American history, getting ready for the final, which will only cover the last part. All right, and don't forget your paper is due by Monday, July 27th. Don't forget to take the second exam. I'll send out little reminders. The announcement thing will go up in Blackboard in a little while. I hope you do well. I'll be grading the essays in it all week. Otherwise, I'll see you guys later. So take care and have a good rest of the week, and drop me an email if you have any questions about anything. All right.